War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 64, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Lest one think the Romans were unstoppable, there is ample evidence to the contrary. In fact, the Romans were far less unbeatable as compared to, say, Alexander, as they were determined and stubborn. The fact is, war is driven by individuals of varying talents and capability, and great empires, armies, and battles are driven by the men who led them far more than the degree of the individuals they led. This drives one of the fundamental debates of warfare, and specifically ground warfare. If the generals switch sides, would the outcome change? The history of warfare, in my opinion, drives far more to the leader being the determinant of victory and far less than the army he led. And certainly the Battle of Teutoburg Forest being a perfect example. The mere fact that to the Romans it was called the Varian disaster would certainly indicate the Romans of the period agreed. The leader of the Roman forces was Publius Varius, and it is he for whom the Romans assign the blame. And to the point, it is hard to argue. To speak of a battle without speaking of the leaders who engaged in it is a disservice both to history and humanity. Any analysis of a war or battle must start with the men responsible for waging it, both the ordinary soldier and, most crucially, who was in charge. Teutoburg Forest is a very good example of this. So a little about Varus. He came from a patrician family. His father fought and lost in the civil war waged between Octavian, later Augustus, and the band of assassins who killed Julius Caesar. So, as an insight into Roman politics, his family name and patrician status was more important than the sins of the father, who himself paid the price for his allegiance, following the decisive battle of Philippi, where the forces of Octavius and Mark Antony defeated Cassius and Brutus. Varus' father, Sextus, killed himself following the battle, following the example of both Cassius and Brutus. Unless you think this some sort of act of nobility, torture and death were the presumed punishments for losing such a war, and such was the almost assured future for all three. You aim for the would-be emperor, you best not miss. Varus, however, remained politically connected and saw several increasingly higher-level positions. He served with Augustus and was named legate or commander of the 19th Legion during garrison duties. Following this, he was named as one of the two consuls of Rome, along with the future emperor Tiberius. Only a few years later, he was appointed governor of Africa, read here North Africa, and soon after Syria and the Levant. It was during the revolt against King Herod, near the time of the birth of Christ, that Varus earned a reputation as a cruel and sadistic tyrant, making liberal use of crucifixions as a form of execution and various other tortures and punishments. So much so he was forced to flee Jerusalem due to popular outrage and continued his governorship from Antioch. His fellow consul, meanwhile, was conquering Germania, then defined as the land to the northeast of Gaul as delineated by the Rhine River. As a side note, Caesar's admittedly self-aggrandizing histories of the Gallic campaign, which is often his campaigns against the German tribes, is outstanding reading nonetheless if you have the time. Tiberius, thus victorious in Germany, returned home to Rome, and Varus left his Levantine posting to serve as governor of Germany, where he continued his haughty ways, but did so to a people, unlike those of the Levant, who were not used to the reigns of servitude and thus chafed even more than the Jews of Judea. While serving, he trusted the Roman citizen and auxiliary cavalry commander Arminius, who would turn out to be his undoing. As noted, Arminius was a Roman citizen, having served with the Roman legions for several years as his father, Segimurius, was chief of a tribe defeated by Rome and forced into allegiance. Both Arminius and his younger brother Flavius were taken hostage and educated in Rome, later serving the new Roman Empire in the Great Illyrian Revolt under Tiberius, earning the title of Equus, below only the senatorial class. Note, the term equestrian comes from this ancient title. Arminius was recalled to Germany to serve under Varus, in helping to quash endless small revolts against the various German tribes rejecting the saddles and spurs of Roman conquest. Note that Arminius is the Latin word for his name, which actually remains unknown. The common German name Hermann comes from Arminius through the Old German language. Also of note, Arminius had a lot of combat experience serving under Tiberius, whereas Verus, while serving as commander of the 19th Legion, saw very little either in that role or while accompanying Augustus. He was far more the politician than the general. Arminius, despite the several years he spent fighting for Rome, never ceased to be a German nationalist. His tribe's affiliation with Rome was not one of conquered and conqueror, but rather self-interested allies working together for their own purposes. Combined with Verus' brutal rule, Arminius sought to liberate the German tribes from Roman subjugation, a fact which Verus was unaware of until far too late. The prowess of the Germans in battle was already well known, following the raid by 3 tribes across the Rhine, leading to the defeat and capture of the 5th Legion's eagle in what was known as the Lollian disaster, named after the 5th Legion's consul. But this was only a raid, and decades earlier, there were as many as 50 separate tribes of Germans, who all maintained a fierce sense of independence and harbored as much resentment to their fellow Germans as they did the Romans. Due to the ongoing revolt in the Balkans, only 3 legions were available to Verus. Verus was moving to his winter quarters on the Rhine when fictitious reports of a revolt were forwarded by Arminius, which demanded immediate attention by the governor and his legions. Some have surmised that Arminius was shaped less by his combat experience with Rome than by the battle under which his tribe was subjugated. The Romans were barely able to defeat the Germans, despite their far better equipment, training, and organization. The Roman legion was most effective in the open terrain, which allowed the legions, sentries, and cohorts to serve in their organized formations. In dense forests and hills, this Roman advantage was negated. Regardless where Arminius learned these lessons, he was determined to apply them. When exactly Arminius determined to betray the Romans is also unknown, but it was at least a year before the battle. Arminius may have benefited more from learning politics from the Romans rather than battle, as he expertly assembled a coalition among the normally uncooperative German tribes. Arminius' allied tribes were already harassing Verus' troops as they foraged during their summer encampment in lands controlled by Arminius' tribe. Arminius' father-in-law attempted to warn Verus of Arminius' treachery, but was ignored, again a tribute to Arminius' political acumen, if not his choice of families to marry into. Verus was convinced by Arminius to attack the rebellious Angrivari tribe on the way back to winter quarters through rugged, wooded terrain in what is now northwestern Germany. The 3 Roman legions, numbering approximately 20,000 with auxiliaries, snaked through the dark forest in a column almost 10 miles long. Mutual support was impossible. The Bructari tribesmen harassed the legions, attacking their baggage train, while the Angrivari awaited in ambush. The Bructari ended this harassment with a barrage of javelins, which was followed by a torrential downpour, forcing Verus to encamp as further movement was impossible and to consolidate his legions following their attrition from the Germanic missiles. Verus consulted his consuls, who advocated for a breakout of the situation with a night march. Unfortunately, and almost assuredly because of Arminius, the route they selected had been prepared by the awaiting Angrivari, who had dug trenches and built up parapets to impede the Roman progress. The Romans marched straight into a prepared wall, behind which the Germans bombarded them with javelins. The Romans tried desperately to seize the position, but, with the recent rain, proved incapable of gaining traction in the mud. Verus' second-in-command attempted to flee with the cavalry, but Numonius Valla was soon caught and killed by the German cavalry. At this, the legions were completely disorganized and broken. Poorly led by Verus and incapable of relying upon their normal tactics, they were soon attacked by Germans on all sides who fought ferociously and absolutely massacred the Romans. The commanding consuls all committed suicide or died leading their troops. Verus himself joined his father in falling on his sword rather than be captured. Just as well, many of the legionnaires who were captured were systematically tortured and killed by the Germans in what some have surmised were religious ceremonies. Some Romans were enslaved and remained in bondage until freed decades later. Following this victory, Arminius led a sweep of smaller Roman forts and garrisons. Some of the survivors managed to join the Roman garrison at Alesia, who held off the attacking Germans and eventually escaped to Rome. Arminius was not content with freeing Germania and attempted to cross the Rhine, but Tiberius arrived with reinforcements and managed to hold the Roman garrison separating Gaul from Germany. The 3 Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were uniquely not reconstituted following the defeat. The 2nd, 20th, and 13th were instead sent to replace them. Arminius sent the severed head of Verus to the king of the Macromoni tribe in hoping to entice them to alliance, which the Marcomanni declined, instead preferring to stay neutral. The severed head was instead sent to Rome for proper burial. The Romans were determined to avenge the humiliating defeat, with Tiberius and later his nephew, the aptly named Germanicus, leading armies of up to 70,000 against the rebellious tribes. Eventually, all three Roman standards were recovered, though it took 30 years to do so. The campaigns were long, expensive, and indecisive. Germanicus was eventually recalled to Rome to receive a triumph, and the Romans eventually determined the cost of conquering Germany was not commensurate with the value. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Roman honor had been avenged, but ultimately, the defeat at Teutoburg marked the high water mark of the northern ambitions of Rome. With it, there remained in Europe a territory unsullied by romantic cultural domination. Had Rome managed to culturally transform the German tribes, the impact, as with all such alternative histories, is incalculable. As for Arminius, his attempts to unify the German tribes to defeat Rome ended up with his ignoble murder through poisoning by his own family. The Romans continued with military adventures throughout northern and central Europe, but never again with the hopes of colonization. Frankly, the lands and villages were of little material value to the empire, and while capable of fighting and winning, garrisoning and maintaining are far harder propositions, something modern armies would do well to remember. As for the battle itself, it is critical to not just look at the rank and positions held by commanding generals, but their actual combat experience. Arminius was a fighter with years of combat experience matched with an unquestioned political acumen. Varus, while holding the requisite titles which would lead one to believe him a highly capable general, in fact had little actual combat experience, merely a facade to support his political ambitions. And of course, knowing your enemy, yourself, and your terrain, Arminius and the Battle of Teutoburg are a case study in how critical these factors are. The battle was won before it started. By the time Varus walked into the German trap, his defeat was preordained. His failings were not one of tactical competence or leadership, but rather blundering into a position so disadvantageous as to lose 3 Roman legions to roughly an equal number of far less trained enemy. In an interesting side note, the site of the battle was only located 40 years ago by an amateur British archaeologist with a metal detector. Arminius and the legend of the battle became the foundation of German nationalism in the 19th century. Hermann, as the Germans call him, and his victory being the subject of artwork, monuments, and musical pieces. The victory at Teutoburg had ramifications well into the 20th century, for good and bad. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.